And this desegregation that begins to pick up speed with the organization that CORE provides and exert that pressure on white traditional segregation, we're going to see that continue to build speed and continue to exert even more influence once we realize that that pressure of desegregation is going to result in legal victories for African Americans against whites regarding segregation. It's going to result in a spark, a movement in the South where desegregation will be coming not just from the North with CORE, but also emerging in the South with a spark that kind of ignites all this tension, this pressure that's been building. And we're going to see the statement of a vision, what it means to protest, why we protest, with the emergence of leaders like Martin Luther King. So as we see the 1950s move forward, the first legal challenge that's going to come to segregation and really give us a difference is going to happen in 1954 with a court case that's very important that you need to know to be culturally relevant in America. It's called Brown versus the Board of Education, and you really need to pay attention to this court case. It's really important. In fact, let's make that be your little slip that you give us. Brown v. Board of Education. It's that important. And here's the idea. A little girl named, from the family of the Browns, Linda Brown, denied access to an all-white school, which is just a couple of blocks away from her house where she lives in Topeka, Kansas. She's forced to walk and ride a bus miles away to an all-black school, and she says this isn't fair. Her lawyer for the court case is a guy named Thurgood Marshall. I've got my pointer on him here for you. He actually later becomes a justice on the Supreme Court, but he is the chief lawyer of the NAACP. And the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is going to say, this isn't right. Why does Linda Brown have to walk and ride a bus so far away in order to go to school? Oh, it looks like Mrs. Davenport's leaving. Bye, Mrs. Davenport. Bye. Is there anything I need to do for tomorrow? No, she says we're done. Sweet. So a bunch of these court cases are going to get all balled together. They're going to go to the Supreme Court. And what we're going to see here is the Supreme Court, for the first time since 1896, say that segregation, at least in schools, is unconstitutional. That separate is not equal in this case. That's a big deal, because for the first time, segregation will be challenged. And you can understand how whites react to this, right? Whites are going to feel threatened. CORE is coming from the North, working their way south, putting pressure on businesses to desegregate. You see schools wanting to be desegregated by now. You're going to see Southerners respond to a call from Harry Byrd, a senator from West Virginia. At this point, he was from Virginia, rather, I should say, West Virginia, say that we should resist the ruling. We should not accept this ruling. And Southerners will rise up in the South and they will say, we will not desegregate our schools because some court tells us to. And so what they'll do is come up with a crafty way to fight against it. Instead of saying that segregation is based on race, what they'll say is it's based on something psychological or some other kind of a test. And they'll call it a pupil assignment law. And they'll say that you can't attend a certain school unless you have a certain literacy rate. And if you don't read well, you have to go to this school over here where they'll help you with reading. Well, of course we know what that looks like, because in African American schools, they don't have access to quality education, so they're not reading on grade level. So if you say all the kids who don't read well have to go to this school over here, of course that's going to be the school for all the black kids. Or if you do what North Carolina does, and you say, well, we don't want kids to feel psychologically pressured by going to school with people that don't necessarily resemble them in their skin color. So we're going to have people attend schools with people from their similar social economic class so that they don't feel, too self-conscious. Well, then you're going to end up with white kids going to school with white kids and black kids going to school with black kids. And these laws will persist for a long time. By 1964, 10 years after Brown v. Board of Education, there are still states where 0 to 1% of African Americans are in school with whites. In other words, there's no desegregation. So in 1964, we still have a really high percent where less than 1% of African Americans are in schools with whites. Look at those percentages, 0.6% in Louisiana in with white students, 0.05% of black kids in white schools in Georgia, 0.007% of black kids in white schools in Alabama. Within 10 years after this ruling, So it's obviously going to go to the Supreme Court, right? Obviously, the Supreme Court is going to look at this and say, dude, this is just not right. You just can't keep this up. You can't keep doing this. And so the Supreme Court is going to look at this and they're going to say, you're right. You're right. You can't use these pupil assignment laws. You have to end segregation with all deliberate speed. What does that even mean? If you do something deliberately, doesn't that mean you take your time with it and make sure you do it right? Well, if I'm supposed to do something deliberately with speed, does that mean I do it fast or that I do it slow? That ambiguity, that questionable phrasing is going to let southern states prevent desegregation all the way up until 1969. And here's the interesting thing. If you look at this in terms of race even now, de facto segregation based on neighborhoods shows tons of school districts around the country that are still highly segregated. In blue are the schools that are incredibly highly segregated where 75% or more of the students are non-white. And then in the lighter colors, at least 25% of the population is still white. In other words, schools where we have a high population of still white people. All over the country, we see high numbers of still segregated schools. So what, you say, right? At least it's a victory. It's a legal victory. That's true. Even though it takes more than a decade and in many ways is still not completely taken care of, it's still a victory.